We're very lucky to have William Devil here to share his new book, Kathy Fiscus, A Tragedy That Transfixed a Nation. Bill is a professor of history and director of the Huntington USC Institute on California and the West at the University of Southern California. He is the author of numerous studies of the 19th and 20th century American West, including Whitewashed Adobe, The Rise of Los Angeles, and the Remaking of its Mexican Past. And now, Bill, I'm going to ask you to take it away.
Thanks, Kelsey. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for being here. I see a number of friends out there. It's wonderful. I'm going to speak in part with Kelsey and in part with a set of images I brought along, but I'm really looking forward to a give and take and conversation. And please don't hesitate to put questions up even as I speak, because we can all, there's a few of us here enough that we can integrate and weave your questions and comments in with my own. So I'm here to talk about this new book, which is I think probably just in terms of page length, maybe the shortest book I've ever worked on. And the sort of per capita sweat and pain of the book was overwhelming in terms of the page count. This is the hardest book I've ever written. And I don't quite know why, although I have some theories. It's an event that maybe many of you on the event this evening are familiar with, but let me give you a quick sketch about it. And along the way, I can probably speak to my fixation with the event. The event is wrapped around this little girl here. This is Catherine Ann Fiscus, known as Kathy, born in 1946 in Southern California here. She was raised in San Marino, where her father worked for a oddly named company called the California Water and Telephone Company, which was a kind of creature of the mergers, the corporate mergers of the era, company that owned rights of way for telephony and telephone access, as well as water wells, reservoirs, and distribution systems in largely the San Gabriel Valley, although it had a bigger footprint as well up north in San Francisco. The event takes place in the springtime of 1949, when this little girl tumbles into a well, an abandoned well out back of her home in San Marino in a field that her father was responsible for as the regional superintendent for this water company. The event begins, we can just keep the slide right here for a second, Kelsey, thank you. The event begins on Friday afternoon, April 8th, 1949, when this little child's mother and Kathy and her big sister Barbara, who was 9 at the time, got into the family Studebaker near Huntington Drive and drove down to Union Station, which was then just 10 years old, and to pick up Alice Fiscus's sister Jeanette, her husband Hamilton, and their 2 boys, Gus and Stanley, who were about the same age as the Fiscus girls, to come up to San Marino from Chula Vista to spend the weekend, the family weekend, as Easter approached. And that afternoon, back at the Fiscus family home, Alice and her sister, Jeanette, were beginning to prepare dinner. It was close to dusk, just about 72 years ago. And they looked out the back window of the kitchen to the 6-acre field where the 4 children, along with the Fiscus family dog Jeepers, were playing. The field had a lot of weeds in it. It's overgrown. It's a perfect play yard for children, and the Fiscus children and their cousins and all the other neighborhood children nearby loved it. There were about a dozen wells in and around that field, many of them capped, some of them still active, and one in particular that is at the heart of this story, both inactive and uncapped. So Barbara and her sister, as they chatted and caught up in the kitchen, Alice and her sister, looked out back in the field, and as mothers do, Alice Fiscus counted children's heads and realized that she was counting 3 children, not 4. So the littlest child, Kathy, had disappeared. And Alice and her sister come out back and ask the older children, "Where's Kathy?" And they say, "We don't know. She was just with us. She lagged behind. She was mad at us. We ran ahead. Maybe she stomped off." There was an elementary school nearby, and the children liked the playground equipment there. So Alice Fiscus assumed that Kathy perhaps had wandered off to the new K.L. Carver Elementary School. But after driving over there very quickly, just several hundred yards in the family car, she came back because she hadn't found her. And as she comes back to the large field, over near a tractor or some kind of disking device that had been taking out the weeds in the field, stopped, and no one was there. Over near that tractor, the littlest boy, Gus, the cousin, who's 5, yelled out, "She's here, she's here." And the adults ran over, and there was an abandoned well casing near that tractor that Kathy had fallen into. The well casing was about 14 inches, or exactly 14 inches actually in diameter, extraordinarily narrow. And Kathy had fallen into that well casing feet first and was down way below the surface of the earth crying. And her mother began calling to her. Okay, Kelsey, we can flip. Thank you. This is the site of the well, which is in there somewhere near where the people are standing. This is early in the evening on that Friday, April 8th, when first responders were called. I found the little card that the San Marino Police Department, which is still located where it was then at the corner of San Marino and Huntington Drive. I found the little card that the desk officer had taken notes on, and it says, "Catherine Ann Fiscus, little girl, has fallen into a hole." What's extraordinary about this picture is it's so early in the rescue attempt. So I want you to hold this picture in your mind's eye as we go through my remarks here, because fairly quickly the scene becomes extraordinarily chaotic and is tinged, of course, by great urgency because a little girl is in harm's way, having fallen into the earth. As adults from the neighborhood, you can see the houses in the distance there, as adults from the neighborhood begin to appear on scene, neighbors, etc., there's thought that perhaps Kathy can be rescued by either something or someone being lowered down her well casing to grab her. And partly this is, I think, encouraged by the fact that she is crying, and her cries are reverberating through the well casing up to the surface of the earth. And perhaps people at first think she hasn't fallen nearly so far as she actually had fallen in. Her uncle Hamilton is on crutches, and he actually attempts to lower one of his crutches down to her, which is nowhere near how far down she's fallen down that well. And a neighbor comes out with a spool of telephone cord and thinks about lowering it down. And then these county firefighters who show up here with this rescue vehicle, there's even thoughts that perhaps, and they even try it briefly, perhaps they can lower down a noosed rope or a lasso rope and have Kathy raise her arms above her head and lasso her beneath her arms, cinch it tight and pull her to safety. This is fairly quickly discarded because it's simply too dangerous. And it's also clear that she's not anywhere near close enough to have this work. A ball is lowered when other rescue workers arrive. A ball is lowered on a tape measure, both to determine how far down she is, but also the ball is lowered on the end of the tape measure to determine if it's going to come up wet or dry. I'll hold that thought for a second. We can go to the next one. Word goes out in the neighborhood fairly quickly. Little girl is in a well. Initially, the firefighters and first responders thought that someone had fallen into the nearby ravine and wash that's still there, comes right out of the San Gabriel Mountains and washes down towards the San Gabriel Mission. But no, sure enough, she's down in this well. And you can see the police officer there cupping his hands at the very center. He's either shouting down to her or perhaps trying to see with the use of that electric light there, trying to see where she is. This is her aunt, Jeanette, with her back to us. And you can see the concern on the faces of the would-be rescuers who show up, because people show up at the scene in the early hours of darkness on Friday night, April 8th, within several hours of when she's fallen in, and think, how are we going to get this little girl out of there? What's fascinating and odd about the event is there are many, many people there over the course of what amounts to just over 48 hours of a feverish rescue attempt. There are many, many people there who are marked by skill at digging in the earth. They knew what to do. I'm sorry, they knew how to do things. They didn't quite know what to do in terms of how do we get her out. So fairly early on, the rescue scene is marked by, of course, urgency, the call goes out to Alice Fiscus's parents, Kathy's grandparents, to come up from San Diego, which they do, and they're there for the entirety of the weekend. And neighbors watch out for Mrs. Fiscus and Dave Fiscus, who shows up from work, as they show up, obviously, here at the site. And Alice Fiscus and her sister sit in the family Studebaker for a good portion of what amounts to this several-day rescue attempt. So the early urgency is noteworthy for the idea that the way to get her out is to lower someone down the way, well, actually the opposite way she went in. She goes in feet first. The way to get her out is to lower someone head first who can reach down, grab her, and pull her to safety. That ball that got lowered down on the tape measure comes up dry, probably hits her. That's the idea. Hit her because she's taking up a good deal of that circumference down below, and comes up dry, which is an encouraging sign, of course, because she's fallen into a water well. The well had been dug or bored in 1903 by a man named Johnson. So it was known as the Old Johnson Well. It had produced water. At one point, the entire property was owned by Henry Huntington, and he watered citrus and probably other fruit there on the property. The well had ceased production sometime in the first third of the 20th century and had at some point, we think, been capped. Something welded or placed or screwed on top of it to prevent children and other things from going down it. But the cap obviously had come off because now this little girl was down there. So the ball comes up dry, but the tape measure comes up measuring 90 feet. She's fallen 90 feet down that well casing, 9 stories, which is just an unimaginable distance to fall down this well, even though the well itself snakes or is plumbed down into the earth far farther than that. But she's 90 feet down, probably caught up in an elbow or something of the casing because it was so old, already about a half a century old, and probably had moved in the earth and moved with the earth in the time since it had been bored. So sending someone down there becomes at least a notion. And in trying to address this mounting feverish urgency, the call goes out to the nearby Santa Anita racetrack. Perhaps the racetrack can send jockeys, and perhaps a skinny man who's a jockey could be lowered by his feet down this well. People show up at the site from the neighborhood and from elsewhere with skinny children and say, this is my son, he's really skinny, put him down there. The call goes out to the circus that perhaps the thin man, there's a traveling circus in LA at the time, seasonal, perhaps the thin man could come and be lowered down the well casing. There's a call out for people who have dwarfism or little people. Somebody thinks that perhaps the Munchkins who had played in The Wizard of Oz only 10 years earlier could be dragooned into trying to save this. I have a picture of another man who showed up here. I'll get to that in a minute. So this idea that maybe we can go down there and get her out the way she came in is floated, as it were, but David Fiscus, her dad, will have nothing of it. He says no one else is going down that well casing. It's too dangerous, and I'm not going to allow it. And also it's impractical. More impractical are some of the other ideas that are floated to the rescue workers and the personnel there who gather. And before long, there are dozens, and then many dozens, and then hundreds. And then over the course of the weekend, as many as 10,000 people come here. I think it's probably closer to between 5,000 and 10,000 people, but a lot of people come because it is a spectacle that is goes out through all the journalistic and media airwaves. We'll get to that in a minute. So other ideas about utilizing her well casing as the way to rescue her include telegrams coming into the San Marino Police Department from all over the world over the course of these 48 hours. A doctor says the way to get her out is to create a vacuum inside her well casing. You create a vacuum strong enough, you'll suck her to safety. She'll get sucked right up to the top. Someone else says, no, pour water down there slowly and she'll rise miraculously to the top. Someone else says, don't do that. Pour sand down there like an hourglass with an hourglass pace, and she'll gradually be able to rise up on that pillar of sand. These are all absurd, and the rescue workers and engineers who congregate there know it. So they quickly dispense with that. So with no notion that actually someone will go down there to get her, the response becomes what you might imagine. Let's dig a parallel shaft, and we'll dig the parallel shaft and go down just below her level, tunnel across to where her well casing has her trapped, open that up with a series of tools and pull her out across the tunnel and then back up the rescue shaft. Construction workers, sewage tank and septic tank digger companies and equipment show up. Before long, by Friday night before midnight, there's great big heavy equipment on the site in that field, which had only recently been the playground of little children. Clamshell diggers, big heavy equipment utilized to at first dig a very large gaping hole that was to go into the earth and then this tunnel across to get her. The scene is lit up by lights that come from 20th Century Fox, Klieg lights, and it does resemble a kind of movie opening in terms of crowds assembled and a lot of anxiety and clearly some great worry on the faces of people who are there. People spend the night on the yards and lawns of the houses nearby. Teenagers climb the nearby trees. The crowd is held back by a series of fences that are hastily put up. And then the rescue workers themselves congregated in the dozens around the site of her fall. The rescue workers feverishly trying to get down to where she is. Okay, let's go to the next one, Kelsey. Thank you. So this is David and Alice Fiscus. They're in vigil as the rescue attempt goes on. As I say, it is nonstop for greater than 48 hours. They spend time in their small home that abuts that field. She spends time in the Studebaker with her mom and dad. He apparently chain smokes and is at the site of her well quite a bit of the time, thanking the workers who are trying to save his daughter. She stops crying at about 2 hours into the fall. And her physician, the family physician, the man who had delivered her, is there at the scene. And he tells the crowd he's certain that what she's done is just nodded off to sleep because she's so scared and exhausted from the anxiety and terror of the fall. So the crowd holds hands, the crowd weeps, the crowd prays, the crowd sings. There are people who are Red Cross workers who are delivering food, coffee, and other items to the rescue workers. And the press comes. Fairly quickly, the print journalists are there. There's an LA Times reporter there by Friday evening, and the word goes out across the wire services that a little girl who's alive is in the well casing deep down below the earth. And of course, then they realize how far down she is, and that becomes part of the story. Print journalists are there. The newsreel motion picture journalists eventually get there. Radio journalists are there. And the story is like wildfire across the United States and across parts of the globe. Front page news on Saturday and especially Sunday as the rescue attempt still goes on. This photograph is taken by a young journalist from the LA Times, young photojournalist from the LA Times, who's 19 years old. He shows up on scene and takes pictures that are different than a lot of the other pictures. He takes pictures not so much of the rescue attempt that's on the site, but he takes pictures of some of those individuals whose lives were obviously touched by this. So he becomes a great and important celebrity photographer later in his career named Lee Weiner. But here he's just 19 years old, taking a lot of pictures. And at one point, he's got his big flash cubes that are attached to his beautiful big camera. And the cousin boys, Stanley and Gus, who've been playing with Kathy, ask him if they can have those, that are the ones that burn out after he flashes. And he gives them to him as a little keepsake. Okay, Kelsey, let's see. Here's a picture of the crowd. You can see the kind of stunned worry on their faces. And that fellow in the very center has that same kind of beautiful camera. He's taking pictures. He may be a journalistic photographer. For all I know, I'm not sure. I don't recognize him. But it's fascinating to see these pictures because it's April of 1949, and by definition, the 1950s haven't happened. But you can tell the 1950s haven't happened. These are kind of countrified folks a little bit. Elvis hasn't arrived yet. The 50s, for all they stood for, et cetera, haven't arrived yet. And people wander over from the neighborhood, and then the streets nearby, Winston Avenue, Los Robles Avenue, Huntington Drive, they fairly quickly get choked with traffic because cars arrive and are pulled off to the side, and people come up to the site and get as close to the spectacle as they can. Okay, let's see the next one. This is a beautiful aerial photograph of the scene. This is probably on Saturday. The two very large rectangular structures on the upper right hand of this photograph are still there. Those are water reservoirs. They're still there. And that's Winston over in the left-hand corner of the top of the photograph. And there you can see the cars parked all alongside there. And then the long, narrow, straight edge that shoots down the left-hand side of the photograph below that road, that's the wash that comes down from the San Gabriel, still right there where it is. And you can see the trail that's been kind of cut into the landscape there as people walk into the site and get as close as they possibly can. That structure in the center, there's next to one of the reservoirs, there's a well, looks like an oil derrick, that's a well. And then the white structure in the very center of the picture is a pump house for a well, it's still there, actually. This is now the site of San Marino Unified High School. This is, the well is actually, I've pinpointed the well with the help of GIS technology and some brilliant spatial scientists, folks who helped me. The well is underneath the end zone of the San Marino football field's western part of the field near the western, sorry, not under the end zone, under the football field near the end zone, very close to the track at about the 4 or 5 yard line. So I can get within probably 5 feet of where the well is because you can pinpoint it using photographs like this and Google Earth, and then the brilliant irrigation and well maps from the early 1920s that were done all over this landscape. So one of the things that I was interested in the book was telling the water story of this landscape. This is a wet landscape because the aquifers beneath San Gabriel, beneath Huntington Drive in the San Gabriel Valley are big. And they seep up to the top through springs and otherwise, and then the wash comes down from the San Gabriel. So in the 19th century, both coincident with the early years of the San Gabriel mission, as well as the American period following the Mexican War, the San Gabriel Valley is one of the most agriculturally productive valleys in all of California. And it's in part because there's a lot of water there. And it's not that far down. Kathy Fiscus falls 90 feet down a well and is presumably dry. But when that well was bored in 1903, they hit water at 7 feet. So they hit water right away. And then they continued boring down, of course, to continue having good water pressure to drive more and more water to the surface. So it's a very watery landscape, and there's a reason why there's a dozen wells scattered through that landscape that this picture takes up. Okay, let's go to the next one. So the workers who come there, fairly quickly a hierarchy develops that's kind of bifurcated. There's the working class septic tank and ditch digging workers, many of whom had been Seabees during the Second World War, which of course had just ended. And because the press is so interested in telling the human story of this, they quickly interview and get to know, in some fashion, a lot of the workers who are volunteering, of course, their time, their energy, their brawn, and their experience to try to save this little girl. There's about a dozen or 15 workers who become, over the course of the 48 hours, identified by first name in the press, first and last name, and their human interest stories become part of the way the reportage takes place across the world. This is the leading foreman of the workers. His name is Homer Blickensderfer, but he was known as Whitey because of that shock of blonde hair. And Whitey Blickensderfer was a jack of all trades. His wife, who came to the scene, was interviewed about him, and she said, that husband of mine can do anything. He worked without fail and without stopping across most of those 48 hours. Moving equipment around, ordering men down into the earth, etc. The bifurcation that I mentioned is a not exactly straight line between the two groups, but there is a line between the two groups. Men like Whitey Blickensderfer, who you can imagine sleeves rolled up working in the earth, and then the construction bosses who run the big engineering and construction firms who are there with their big equipment. And fairly quickly, certainly by Saturday, a division takes place between the decision making as to how to save this little girl. Once the going down her well is set aside as an option, essentially 2 rescue operations ensue, which is on the one hand fascinating, on the other hand unfortunate, because 2 takes more time than 1, and time is of the essence here. The first is run by essentially the construction bosses who want to dig a big cavern and lower men down that cavern, which I'll show you in a minute, which to my mind, as a Western historian, looks like a tiny copper mine, great big hole in the earth. And get down there with the big equipment chewing up the earth, get to where she is or just below her, and then go in and get her out. Men like Blickensderfer and others, including a guy I interviewed before he passed, thought that this was a waste of time and that the big hole would collapse on itself, because we're dealing with clay, kind of silty earth, and it's wet. There's a lot of alluvial sands that have come off the San Gabriels for millennia. They thought that the way to do this was actually to dig a well, to basically dig a hole slightly broader in circumference than hers, but line it with steel, steel piping, and big chunks of steel piping that could be welded one on top of another as the well goes, or the hole goes deeper and deeper into the earth. But essentially dig a narrow hole that won't fall in on itself, and then you can protect the workers by having them go inside those chunks of steel piping and work from inside steel casing down the earth, slowly down, digging down, digging down, digging down, pile driving another link of steel on top, and then another, until you get down to somewhere near where you think she is. And then the real hard work comes in terms of tunneling across somehow to try to create this small space into which a man could go and then pop a hole in her well and hopefully rescue her. Okay, let's go on to the next one. There's the big one. If you'd showed me this and I didn't know this was the Kathy Fiscus rescue, I'd think it's some weird big construction scene, maybe a mine. A lot of miners show up here, actually. Mining out in Norco and Corona was big, although a lot of the mines had come into trouble. So a lot of experienced miners and out of work miners or underemployed miners show up here at this scene to offer their help. That, for all I know, those 2 guys in the center that are being lowered by that cable may be miners. So this is the big hole, and the workers of Whitey Blickensderfer's capacity and work said, get that big heavy equipment out of here. It's obvious why. They think that perhaps that the vibrations, et cetera, could potentially shake Kathy further down her well casing where she's trapped. There's police officers in this picture. There's some women, Red Cross workers or others, wives of the workers who come. Sheriffs are here. Newsmen. So the guy, if you see a suit and tie, it's probably a reporter. And on Saturday, the television stations show up. It had gone out already on the wire services through print and radio. And 2 television stations show up. And KTLA is the one that everyone knows, but KTTV is there as well. Now, televisions, there's about 20,000 television sets in LA in the period. And televisions had yet to break through as newsworthy. There are children's puppet shows, sort of Kukla, Fran, and Ollie. There's sports, but the notion that television could be newsworthy is not particularly well known at the period, in part because the idea of having a remote television broadcast was seen as impossible. So one very important television producer of the era, a man named Klaus Landsberg, he sends his 2 cub reporters to the scene, essentially as an experiment, because the notion is if you try a remote television broadcast, for one, you'll melt the equipment if it's out in the sunshine for too long. It'll actually destroy the equipment, big, bulky television cameras. And the other is, we don't think the live remote broadcasting is going to work. Well, there's a quirk here. Due north of this cavern and the site is Mount Wilson. And they've got the ability on top of Mount Wilson through transmission to broadcast live television. And they do it. They do it for 24 hours. It revolutionizes American news television. It renders what it thought to be impossible entirely possible. And people in LA either with those very expensive at the era, $600, $700 tiny screen TVs, or the televisions that were left on in the appliance stores where they're sold, left on 24 hours or more. People watch it, and they watch this event, and they watch this event unfold, and they watch this event, every bit as anxious as the eyewitness viewers who are there. American news television has never been the same, and in some extension, American media has never been the same. This proves that remote television news is both possible and also that there's a public very, very hungry for it. Okay, let's see the next one. This is just one of these strange, I wouldn't have believed this till I found this photograph, or this photograph was actually given to me. You may recognize this man. This is Johnny Roventini, who is the Philip Morris pitchman. He sold cigarettes as a very famous pitchman in a bellhop outfit. And he shows up at the site at the invitation of I don't know whom, in his bellhop outfit as a candidate, presumably, to go down the well, because he's a small person, to go down the well for her. He doesn't, but he's there as, potentially an option until David Fiscus and others put the kibosh on it. Okay, let's see the next one. Here's the scene, probably either mid to late day Saturday or Sunday. You can see from the first image I showed you of the LA County Fire Department how chaotic the scene has gotten with these cranes and these heavy diggers. There's the big cavern there at the very center, but the smaller one has already been started by the time this happens. And in a sense, there's a lot of people in charge, and there's nobody in charge, even though there are people who are in charge. There's too many cooks in a sense, but it's just the urgency of the event to try to get this little girl out. And the workers work with really kind of unbearable heroism to dig and dig and dig. They're working with, at times, electric tools, but then they hit water down below, and the electric tools pose an electrocution danger, so they move to pneumatic tools. They work to levels of exhaustion. Things cave in. The big hole begins to cave in on itself. It's abandoned for the littler one. And there's just real danger down there. It's very hot down below the earth, as far down as they go. And there are medics who are caring for these guys as they're coming out and taking rest breaks. Many of them have small children. The man I interviewed was 25 years old when he showed up here. He already had 5 children at home and said that he wanted to come and try to save her. He had a new TV, and he knew about the rescue attempt in part because of the television. Okay, let's go. Thanks, Kelsey. So this is the smaller of the two. There's the steel. Men worked inside that, lowered down in parachute harnesses or otherwise. Whitey Blickensderfer is one of the workers who gets down far below the earth. A man named Bert Herpel. The man I interviewed, his name was Clyde Harp. Bill Yancey. Others, they all become kind of first name basis reference in the newspapers and with the television broadcast. The television broadcasters broadcast nonstop for 24 hours. They don't take a break. They tag team with one another. There are 2 journalists for each television station. They interview people. They pass the time. It's kind of an odd broadcast in a sense because much of what's being filmed is out of sight. In other words, they're filming as men are working below the earth, and they've got their microphones to pick up some of the cadences of the rescue attempt. It's a lot of profanity from the workers, at least until we get to the point, the moment where the sad truth becomes known. So this is later in the evening on Sunday. The man in the boots who's got his feet on the casing is the physician, one of the family physicians. There were 2 in practice, general practice, who were the Fiscus family physicians. And this man had gone back and forth to the site and to St. Luke's Hospital in Pasadena, where a whole team was ready to receive her if she could be pulled out alive. He was summoned here, and he was told that he had to go down the well, down the rescue casing, because the workers had successfully tunneled across. There was a cave-in in the tunnel, but it was shored up as almost like a mining cavern. And they got to her well and opened it up and discovered her. Then he was asked to come to the scene and he was strapped into this device, sling, and began to be lowered down the casing. But he was claustrophobic by the account of one of the workers, who was the man I think they're holding the tether on him. And he had a panic attack, and wasn't quite certain why he was being lowered down there, except that he knew they'd discovered her. Whereupon the worker, who had been working for 48 hours, claims he slugged him, knocked him woozy, and they lowered him down. So he goes down into the casing, and he's down there because they've discovered her, and she, to their eyes and experience, is no longer alive. And that's precisely what he determines too. So he pronounces her dead, and he comes back up. The crowd is asked to respectfully disperse. The family is notified after that, or before that. In the words of one of the journalists who was part of the notification group, Kathy, they told the parents that Kathy was not going to be coming home that night. The crowd respectfully dispersed, and then over the course of the next many hours, the rescue workers retrieve her body, dress her. She'd been in her dress, but they put her in a onesie, a new onesie, romper, and slowly guide her body up through this rescue casing to the top. And the men who are doing it, all profanity fades, and they're seen to be very, very respectful. Her to be, easy men, easy, careful, be careful. And it takes them hours to get her up. Okay, let's see the next one. There's a shroud that was put up after her body was retrieved. Okay. And then I'll end here in just a second. Thousands and thousands of dollars pour in from around the country to the rescue workers, including kids that crack their piggy bank. It doesn't come to the family. It's not a GoFundMe kind of thing we would do today, probably for the family. It goes to the workers, who then are divvied up the money by one of the bosses there, who creates basically an algorithmic formula for how dangerous their labor was, how long and how far below the earth they were. They get more shares, which equals, it's pinned to a share is worth $8, I think. And they get quite a bit of money. The man I interviewed, Clyde Hart, bought a brand new car. Some children, a man donates his money to a home for sick children who buy a TV that they named Kathy. It's a remarkable response. What's even more remarkable is that women write to Alice Fiscus from all over the world and say, either I'm pregnant, or if I become pregnant, and if I have a little girl, I'm going to name her Kathy. We're so sorry for your loss. And they do that. This event changes the naming patterns of American little girls at the beginning of the baby boom. Kathy had been a given name of a certain choice, certain percentage choice, or not, ranking of names. After this event in the early 1950s, it leaps in popularity, and no other little girl's name does that. Names move across in fads and jump a couple spaces. Kathy's name leaps way above where it had been, the name Kathy. And many, many people, as I worked on this book, told me they were named for this little girl. Now, I didn't know that. It took going to Social Security data to determine that. I'm certain that is the reason that name jumps in popularity. And insofar as we try to find something meaningful out of this event, there's a couple of things. A lot of laws are passed after this called Kathy Fiscus laws, which protect children and others from wells that have been abandoned. So the regulations around abandoned wells are tightened up. Alice Fiscus said for years, for 50 years after this event, she at least could take some solace in the fact that Kathy's death had probably saved a great many children from similar fate. And I think she's probably right. And then there's this naming, which a lot of these people who've talked to me about their own names, as well as, their own name's Kathy, as well as other children at the time, said their parents hardly let them out of their sight for a couple of years. They were so protective and so scared about the dangers that their neighborhoods and their fields and their abandoned wells pose. So insofar as those little girls named Kathy may have I don't know, receive some extra balance of love from their parents who knew how precious the life of these little ones was. I don't know, but I've spent more than a decade thinking about this event. I'm pleased as can be to have the book done. I loved working with Angel City Press and everyone there. And I've not completely taken this from around my head and heart, but at least I have the book now, and I think I can probably move on to other projects. But I was utterly fascinated with this and the intricacies of trying to put this event together in the ways in which I thought the puzzle pieces should be put together. So let me stop right there. Thank you all very much for your attention. I'd be happy to answer. We have some time. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about it. And I hope I haven't talked too much. Bert, nice to see you, Bert.
Nice to see you, Bill. Thank you so much for doing this. I have to confess, I found myself getting choked up as you came to the peroration of your
Yeah.
presentation. So
Yeah.
I apologize if I get a little
It's
emotional.
okay.
Now, just a brilliant presentation, incredibly interesting. A couple of questions. We've had Hector Tobar at the store, and he talked about Deep Down Dark, the Chilean miners who were in the collapsed well. A couple of years ago, we heard the story about the kids in Thailand who were caught in the cave.
Yeah.
Each of those circumstances ended in litigation. I wondered if there is something about America in the 40s, kind of writ large, that you as a historian could divine from the public reaction to the way that this thing played out. And does it tell us, is it an insight into America before the 1950s?
It's a great question. I will say, as to those other subterranean events, Kathy Fiscus is always brought up. Whenever people are in harm's way, particularly children, and particularly below the earth, the Kathy Fiscus case is brought up and people are asked to compare it. I think it's slightly speculative on my part, but I do think the immediate post-war, the relief at the end of the Second World War, the suburban hopefulness of particularly California, as well as other parts of the country. But the notion that we've come out of the Depression, we've come out of the Second World War, we have the suburban dreams of so many. I think that there, and also the media capital of California, which already is a very important media capital, if not already the one. I think there is a way in which this event, in essence, catches people up short because it's so tragic and they're so spellbound by it, that I think it can't help but have something to do or say about the hopefulness of the era that is being called back or questioned or, challenged by this event. So I do think there's something to it in that way. Someone asked me if I was able to interview Stan Chambers. Yes, I met Mr. Chambers at his home and also one other place that I can't recall now, and we talked about the event. He never shook this event from his repertoire or from the cascade of his career. It made him a household name, I think, and the event always stuck with him. And he was often a presence at the 20-year, 30-year, 40-year, 50-year anniversaries of the event in spring times of 69, 79, 89, et cetera. So it was a pleasure to interview him and talk to him about it. And his son, actually, his son has been helpful to me. And many people have helped with this book. A man who was obsessed with it, as I was, got in touch with me years ago and said, "I'm not going to write a book on Kathy Fiscus. I've gone on to other things. Would you like to have the photos I've gathered as well as the tape cassettes that I'd done in 1979 with first responders?" And he gave them to me. And they're astonishing. So Mrs. Fiscus, firefighters, rescue workers, he interviewed a lot of them in 1979, and it's the single most generous scholarly act that I've ever been the beneficiary of. Who else has a question?
I have a few questions.
Go for it. And then
But also thank
Kelsey,
you again, Bill.
Yeah, Kelsey, and then we'll go to Bob. Yeah.
Wonderful. I mean, 10 years is it's a long time to be spending researching the subject, and you've done an incredible amount of work. What was the most surprising fact you came across?
I think it's the naming patterns. So the naming patterns jumped out at me, and I did it on a whim. I thought, I think I met someone who said I was named for her. And I thought, wow, that's some kind of act of tribute on the part of those parents in condolence or solidarity or something. It's beautiful. So that was one. And also, I would say, not surprising fact, but surprising falsehoods. There's a lot about this story that I think are wrong. A number of years ago, a man claimed that he'd been lowered down the well and that he had her, but she slipped from his grasp. And it's not true. So I think, and then a lot of the sequences of the events have gotten wrong. And also the well has moved, not literally, but in people's consciousness. I've been told for years, it's under the tennis courts at the high school. No, it's up on the athletic field where there's a plaque, actually. No, it's over here on the track. Well, it's understandable. It doesn't really look much at all like it did. There's some oak trees that are still there. There's a couple of structures that are still there from that time, but it's a high school football field. So it's understandable that people didn't know where it was. And for me, for reasons that I can't really explain, it became very important that I find it. Bob.
Yeah, I just want to build a little bit upon Bert's question about the context of the times in which it occurred. In 1949, we had some pretty larger than life political figures. I guess Earl Warren was governor, correct? And Richard Nixon, I don't know if he was the congressman in that district or not, but I wondered if in your research you kind of looked at was there a public reaction from political figures? How quickly did it arise? Did they do the thoughts and prayers? Did they propose remedial legislation? What was the reaction of the people who were in a position to maybe do something about it?
Yeah.
How long did it take?
Great question, Bob. Nice to see you. David Fiscus had been testifying up at the California Assembly within a day before Kathy falls in on well safety. Not children and vulnerabilities, but actually the toxins and pollutants that could seep from old wells into the water table, et cetera. He was concerned about water quality at that testimony. But because he had testified and because the representatives knew him because of that testimony, there's quite a bit of resolution activity after the event, thoughts and prayers, pass a resolution in a memorial for her. So there's that. But also there's a nationwide response, which I found a little peculiar, but maybe understandable given the period, where people say this kind of heroism and this kind of solidarity that took place at the well site between essentially people in the coat and ties and the people in the dungarees. This wouldn't happen in the Soviet Union. So it becomes a Cold War placing. This is America, where we all work together to go rescue this little girl, and this wouldn't happen in the communist bloc. So that's pretty wild to use it that way, but it's pretty common in the period. Whether Richard Nixon or even Earl Warren commented on it, I don't know.
I had a question.
Sure.
Thank you for this.
Sure.
So interesting. During your interviews, I'm assuming her parents were not alive anymore, but were you able to interview anybody from the family or the sibling or?
Yes, great question. I interviewed all three of the kids, Barbara, Stanley, and Gus. Gus, who'd been 5, he took a little effort to find, but these days you can't disappear these days. The internet can find you. So I got Gus lying on the phone, and he answered the phone, and I said, I'm an historian. I'm working on this book. I think you're Kathy Fiscus's cousin. And he said, no one has ever asked me that. He said, I am. But his memories were spotty because he was hustled off the scene and put in a neighbor's house during the rescue attempt. His big brother remembered more of it, Stanley. And then Barbara Fiscus, who's still living. Stanley Lyon has died since, but Gus and Barbara are alive. Barbara is a absolutely lovely woman in San Diego County who gave me family photographs and told me about the day. She said an immensely poignant thing, which is in the book, which is that as she grew into teenage years and beyond, she would occasionally or even often tell people she was an only child. And she said when her mother got wind of that, she was always furious with me. So Barbara was really a real help to me.
May I just observe one thing, and perhaps it's in closing. Two things, I guess. Kelsey, I'm going to invite to tell you how you can buy this book online or in the store, since we are in business after all. But it strikes me that this is your story is in a sense consonant with the idea of a local bookstore and community and people being focused on things that are bigger than themselves and involve helping others or thinking about others or bringing people together. And I think this is a wonderful reminder of, even from a tragedy, what it means to be part of a community and people struggling together about something that is important to everybody. And so for that reason alone, Bill, I really want to thank you again for first writing the book, but more importantly at the moment, for being here with us tonight and telling this story. It makes me filled with a sense of hope and a reminder of what we can all do if we try to act together as a community. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Bert. I appreciate that, and I agree with you. I also think microcosmically, any book is the product of a number of people who, this book doesn't exist without the help I got, both in terms of the interviews and people who gave me memories and artifacts, but then that tight-knit community at the publisher who got it, who supported me in doing it, and who made it a much better book than I would have done if I had to do it all by myself. So absolutely correct.
And on that note, I would love to tell you how you can purchase this fascinating book. One, Chevaliers, as Bert said, we are open for distance shopping. If you feel comfortable, we'd love to see your faces from 6 feet away. We're at 133 North Larchmont Boulevard, across the street from our old location, but it would be an absolute pleasure. Otherwise, you can, we have a link on our website for thebookshop.org where you can purchase the book as well, or drop us a line at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. But thank you again, Bill. This was truly so intriguing, and I think you really taught everyone here tonight so much about California's history.
Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to see you all. Nice to see my friends out there. Everyone
Thank
be
you.
well. Be well. Thank
See
you.
Bye, Bill.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone, and good night.
Also, our son is in the LASA program right now.
Oh, who is that? Oh, Aiden.
Aiden Gerber.
Aiden,
Yeah,
of course. Of course. Say hi for me.
I will. He came down a little while ago and he had to go eat dinner, but he was down here. So
Awesome.
we
Great.
were like, do you know that guy?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Very
All right.
interesting. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Kelsey,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
again, everyone.